Good morning. This is Changing with God from St James's Church. My name's Ali Campbell, and I'll just be sharing a few thoughts on the passage from Sunday, just to help us to go deeper in our relationship with God, think a bit more about who He is and how that impacts our lives, how we live, how we interact with one another, all with the hope of us becoming more like Him as we seek to worship and serve Him. So, we're in the last chapter of Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, and there's absolutely loads that happens in here. Right at the beginning of the chapter, we've got the resurrection. We've got the women turning up at the tomb to embalm Jesus' body. They're told, He's not here. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? They rush back to tell the men. The men don't believe them. Luke's one of those, the guy who writes this Gospel. And he says it was as nonsense to them what the women were telling them. Jesus is alive. Jesus is risen. How can this be? They don't believe it. But Peter rushes to the tomb to see for himself, and then inexplicably just goes home to think about it. That's what it says. And I'm like, what? Anyway, that's happening. Then Luke writes, that same day, two of them were going to Emmaus from Jerusalem. That's about 7 miles, so I don't know, a couple of hours maybe, if they're just walking along. Jesus joins them, and then they don't recognise who He is. He has a conversation with them, He opens the scriptures to them, they get all excited about this guy who's telling them things from the Bible about who Jesus was. They end up back at their house in Emmaus, they break bread, Jesus is about to pray, and then they realise it's Him, boof, He disappears. They turn around and head the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. So I reckon these guys have been on the road for 4 hours. They turn up back with the rest of the disciples and try and explain what's happened because they've recognised that Jesus is alive. He joined them on the road. They have this conversation. It's that point Jesus turns up Himself, and that's where we are in our passage from Sunday's teaching. Now, if I was one of those followers, I'd been a bit naffed off. I'd have thought, well, if we knew Jesus was going to do this, we wouldn't have walked 7 miles back from Emmaus. We'd have let Him just tell them Himself. But anyway, there they are going, we've already done this. But Jesus is there, and the rest of the disciples are amazed, are gobsmacked, cannot believe what is happening. There's this little verse 38, and it says this. He said to them, why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Just that one verse. He's rocked up, he said, peace be with you. He's in the room with them. And there's this one verse that really struck me. And the Greek for that word doubt is where we get the word dialogue. And I'm just imagining, what if they're kind of going, it's Jesus. Is it Jesus? Can't be Jesus. It's Jesus. Is it Jesus? I don't know if it's Jesus. It's Jesus! No, it's not. It can't possibly be. It's Jesus. And the dialogue thing, it's a back and forth is the kind of meaning for the word. And it's that kind of, when I don't know if you ever have an internal dialogue going on, where you're not talking to anybody else, you're having a conversation with yourself. Maybe it's times when you're telling yourself off and you're doing that internally. Maybe there are times when you're defending yourself internally, you're justifying something you've done. Nobody else can hear this conversation going on. It's just going on inside your own head. And it's for me, it's like that's what's going on. They're back and forth in their own minds about, is this Jesus? Can this be Jesus? Is this really happening? And the next bit, which I find kind of wonderful, actually, is another verse that links with that kind of back and forth and what is going on and how can I process what's happening right in front of me. And it's this verse. While they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, Jesus then asks them a question. So, while they still did not believe it, and then it says, because of their joy and amazement. Have you ever been so overwhelmed by something that's happening that just your ability to process anything rationally goes out the window? You're just so overwhelmed, you don't quite know what to do with yourself. And that's the feeling I get from this passage, is that's what's happening for the disciples. Their whole world has been turned upside down. Everything is different from this moment, but they can't grasp that just yet. So that kind of sense of it's like a dream, is the kind of sense I'm getting from that kind of unbelief. How can this be, is where they're at. And I just kind of feel like maybe that's where some of us feel we're at ourselves at the moment, with all that's going on in the world, finding it so hard to process things that maybe we feel a bit like those disciples encountering Jesus for the first time after the resurrection, emotionally, spiritually, all over the place. Maybe you've got your own internal dialogue trying to process what's happening in the world, how you're feeling about things, how you're doing personally, how things are going with you in your home, if you're sharing your home with other people. So Jesus speaks straight into their gobsmackedness, what is going on, amazement, awe, wonder, dreamlike state, and he makes some things real. So he says, it's really me. Look at my hands, look at my side, touch me. You know, I'm a physical being, I'm right here, this is me. And then that's not enough. He asks them if they've got anything to eat. And then he does something just really normal. He eats some fish. So there aren't lightning bolts flying out of his fingers. Yes, he's appeared in the room, but then he does some really normal things just to demonstrate that it's still him. The other thing that reminds the disciples that it's still Jesus is he's doing a Jesus thing, which he did all the time that he was nurturing them as his followers, and asks them questions. You know, why this, why that, what's going on for you? Which is Jesus through and through, isn't it? He does that. He asks questions. So off the back of those kind of little thoughts, here's some questions for you to think about. Where are you at? Are you a bit emotionally, spiritually, all over the place, back and forth, maybe struggling a bit with some unbelief, this dreamlike state that we're in as we're in lockdown of what is happening in the world? Where is God in this? How can I see him and know that he's present? How can I reach out and touch something real in the midst of this unreality that it feels like we're in, with all its horror, all the shocking things, and also those pinpricks of light as people do wonderful things to support others and champion others, yet it feels unreal in so many ways. Back and forth we go. So how are you doing with that? Are you finding yourself going back and forth in your thinking and your thoughts? And then another question, I guess, is what for you would make Jesus's presence real in this space and in this time? And for me, I've often found it's in the most mundane, ordinary things where I have a sense of God's presence and his peace. We've been enjoying family walks, just taking time to go for a walk. And I think, you know, in my mind, with all that's going on, just walking in the fresh air, having a little bit of space with the girls and with Lisa to just spend some time doing a normal thing in the midst of what isn't normal, is feeling like a real rooted sense of, you know, place and a sense of habit that's really working for me in terms of how I'm doing emotionally, spiritually, in the midst of this crazy time that's going on. And also having a sense in that space of God being with us as we're walking through the countryside. It's glorious weather around us at the moment, and just seeing blossom on the trees. The world is still turning. Stuff is still... God's creation is kind of rejuvenated as we as human beings have needed to step back from some of our usual activity in the world. So just that space to delight in what God has done in making the world, and that we're still in it, we're still present in it, and he is here, and he is with us. That sense of his real presence. So what for you makes God real right now in these troubling times?